I'm not sure if you heard the conversation we had there with Stephen Engel, just on the trade spat really being partly to blame on this global slowdown. I'm sure you've been following the headlines on these negotiations between the two sides. Do you think we could get a deal over the next 4 weeks or so?
Well, you know, this really gets us back to the conflict among Trump's advisors, between those who really don't believe you can negotiate with China and that for the United States national security, you really ought to be disentangling yourself, America, from China to the maximum extent possible. And the advisors who are looking at global markets and looking at U.S. stock markets and are concerned about stability and predictability for business. And I think Trump seemed to have swung toward the hawks in this whole thing at the beginning and was willing to let, you know, there be bloodletting and the farmers get hurt and all the rest of it. But it does seem that he's beginning to realize these broader ramifications. And it makes you wonder whether the IMF and the WTO comments are actually in some ways directed at trying to get his attention and get him rolling towards an agreement that, you know, creates at least a truce.
And Claire, it seems like what the sticking point, at least on Beijing's side right now, is whether to lift those U.S. tariffs. Do you think the U.S. wants those tariffs in place as a form of an enforcement mechanism? And is that the right approach?
Well, I do think that the United States administration has been pretty clear that they're not going to just take, you know, 10 commandments from on high coming from Beijing and accept that as if it's going to be, you know, enforceable change on the ground in the market in China. And I think, you know, the history of China's kind of maybe one step forward and two steps back, you know, justifies that skepticism. So the real question is, how do you look credible? How does Trump take a half a loaf, because he's not going to get everything that he's asking for? You know, how does he take that and look credible? One of the things he has to do is keep his hand on the enforcement side and basically say, we're not patsies, and, you know, we're going to leave some restrictions in place until we actually see change on the ground. That's going to be what they want. Now, you know, where everybody ends up is obviously a big black box, given that I think Trump will be really making the call on this, and we just don't know where he's going to come out.
It's hard to disentangle politics as well, especially in the U.S. We are, of course, moving into 2020. As a follow-up to Yvonne's point, the longer these tariffs stay in place, the more people get used to them, the more it becomes almost reality for businesses on the ground. I'm just wondering, are we underestimating the likelihood that these tariffs will remain in place just because it really benefits a lot of the farmers, especially in the U.S.?
Well, I don't think the farmers in the U.S. are feeling very benefited right now. I think they have kind of stood by the policy direction as a means of trying to get China to change some of its distorted market practices. But I think it's got to be getting old for them. And certainly China has offered some gifts along the way with some of these recent soybean purchases and the like that are probably intended to remind the farmers, you know, of that massive market that's out there, which I think they don't want to be cut out of. But I do agree with you that if the tariffs stay on and if the China hawks in the administration get their way, then what they're looking to do is actually change business decisions and change supply chains. But right now, I think it's extremely difficult for business because no one knows whether they should actually be investing in a shift in supply chain or whether they are really going to see an end to this soon. You know, given the broad ramifications and instability that will come if the trade war doesn't at least come to, as I say, a truce.
And Claire, we've seen some reports that China is perhaps backpedaling on prior agreements when it comes to intellectual property protections. If tariffs remain still in place, what can the U.S. actually offer to get those concessions back on the table?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, I think the rumors have been that, China offered something, and then what the U.S. thought they'd offered, the Chinese either backpedaled or said, no, that isn't what we meant. And that's not surprising during a negotiation, particularly if things aren't going very well at a particular moment. I think it's going to be it's very tough because China is not going to want to pull out its best last offer until it knows that, or has a much better sense that it's the end, because otherwise there's a serious risk that they're going to put that on the table, and then they're going to get told that that's not enough, and they're going to be asked for more. So it's a very, very difficult situation for the Chinese to figure out what to do. And I think recently they've tried to sort of sprinkle a number of positives. They put in the law that they won't steal technology. They've bought soybeans. They're talking about making other changes in intellectual property laws. They got rid of one law that was very problematic. So they're doing sort of easier things and smaller things that are, I think, designed to create a better environment so that the United States doesn't just get ticked off and leave the table and have Trump decide to put more tariffs on.